My name is Alejandro Roark, and I am the Executive Director for Hispanic Technology and Telecommunications Partnership. HCTP is a CEO roundtable of 16 of the country's oldest and largest Latino civil rights organizations who work in coalition to promote access, adoption, and the full utilization of technology and telecommunications resources by the Latino community across the United States. Through our community engagement, congressional education, and by serving as a national voice for Latinos in tech and telecom policy, HCTP member organizations work to support the social, political, and economic advancement of Americans of Latino descent by facilitating access to high-quality education, economic opportunity, and effective healthcare through the use of technology tools and resources. Critical to our ability to create inclusive digital tools and to mitigate any unintended consequences for communities of color is the importance of having representative voices at the table during every aspect of a product's development, testing, and deployment. And that takes diverse next generation leaders who are ready to lend their creativity and ingenuity to help solve our most pressing societal problems, both in the workforce and in Congress, to fulfill the promise of the internet. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Marco Davis, CEO of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, to our kitchen table conversations on race, technology, and the future of everything. Marco, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Of course. And so, Marco, you've spent over 25 years investing in and nurturing diverse leaders through leadership development programs, access to broader education opportunities, and by promoting increased levels of education attainment, as well as dedicating a significant part of your career to community advocacy and civic engagement. And now as a CEO for the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, you lead efforts to develop the next generation of Latino leaders. Do you mind sharing with us a little bit more about your background, your personal passion for equity and inclusion, and a little bit more about your work with CHCI?
Sure. Happy to do that. So first, to help explain some of this grounding, as it's increasingly important these days, share a little about my identity. So I am the son of immigrants, born and raised here in the U.S., and actually grew up in New York. But my father is Jamaican, from Jamaica, West Indies, and my mother is from Mexico, right? And so that's not a usual, typical kind of combination, much less for folks growing up in New York, of all places. But that is really, I think, in some ways central to my whole journey, because from a very early age, from as far back as I can remember, in almost every room I was in, except perhaps with the exception perhaps of a room with my two older sisters as a kid, I was always a little different, right, than everybody else around me. I was hanging around. I went to a town that was majority, an elementary school that was majority black, right, and hung around with the black community. I was accepted as black, but they were like, there's a little something different because he speaks Spanish, right? Or they would see my mom, who was Mexicana and fairly light-skinned Mexican, right? And so there was that. And then same thing, we would hang around with Latino communities. We would go to Mexico. My mother was born and raised in Guadalajara. And same thing, like we felt fully Mexican, but people were always like, tiene un poquito de sol, there was always something a little bit different because they sort of knew that my father wasn't Mexican, and particularly and specifically was black, right? And so in my mind, I think that's something that's always kind of stayed with me around my thinking around diversity and my thinking around inclusion, in that the way I responded to that, interestingly, was to sort of throw myself headfirst and wholeheartedly into embracing these communities and learning as much about them and being sort of as representative as I could be, right? So I always had tremendous pride in my heritage and in my identity, and tried to present it and to rationalize it, if you will, or something, defend it. So that was sort of a core piece, I think. And so the short version of the story is that education was something that was a really critical part of my life. Education had been really significant for my dad. And so he pushed my sisters and I to sort of really do the best we could in education and to get the best educations we could. And it was by the time I got to college that I started to discover that there was kind of a systemic kind of component to education, which was contrary to sort of the intuitive thinking and even on occasion the messages that folks got, which was that like some folks are smart and some folks aren't, as if it were something innate and inherent. I started to realize there was also a systemic component, in that there were people in college in particular I found who I thought were far smarter than me, but who I found struggling in some of our shared classes. And I realized part of it was because I had gone to a private high school that had really prepared me for that coursework, right? And these folks had actually overcome a whole bunch of other challenges and had not gone to schools that had really set them up to succeed as well. And therefore they were having to make up for that, right? And to catch up. And that I started to realize that there were, again, a systemic component. And in fact, built-in kind of inequities and barriers that really, again, sort of informed the course of my life about realizing that some communities, some populations are held back from opportunities, are not able to access, and particularly education was one of the things I did see. And so I realized that, again, that there is a need to sort of level the playing field. There's a need to sort of bring about that equity and to make sure everyone gets a fair chance. And finally, how I settled on my understanding of how I could help to advance that issue and that cause was I decided that in my mind, one of the most effective ways to address all of these large systemic issues was to ensure that we had more leaders from our communities who were in positions of influence, who were in place to make decisions, to direct allocations of resources and efforts, et cetera, who would then represent our interests and also, again, try to ensure a fairer playing field and more opportunities for everyone. And so I started working in various different roles and ways to essentially sort of do leadership development to try and help develop both that personal pride and that higher ambition for folks from our communities, but also then to equip them with the tools and the supports and the networks that they needed in order to actually get into and access those leadership roles.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing with us a little bit about your personal background. That's actually, there's some nuggets in there that even I kind of known you or kind of been to some of your programs didn't know. So thank you so much for that. Great introduction to yourself and to that work. We know that CHCI works on a broad range of issues and hosts a variety of programs like your early career training series, your public policy fellowships, your graduate fellowships, your internship program, which I feel like everybody that I know in DC has in some way kind of gone through either one of those programs. And that's only to just to kind of name a few. And you guys also kind of started hosting a couple years back an annual tech summit where you discuss emerging trends, policy issues, and opportunities in technology such as equitable access for communities of color, digital privacy, and cybersecurity. As we kind of explore the intersection of race and technology and opportunity throughout today's summit, do you mind sharing with us more about your Tech Summit program and why you feel like that it's important for us to develop young leaders who are fluent in issues pertaining to technology and telecommunications policy?
Absolutely. So the way in which this and all of our summits came about, by the way, is that, and before I got here, so I can't take credit for it. I've just been helping to push it forward. We as an organization realized that in addition to doing the programs you just mentioned and being successful in them and helping to develop new generations of leaders, we also realized we were in a pretty unique position with some opportunity to actually help drive some conversations forward. And in fact, it would even in turn serve as a really good kind of learning opportunity for our emerging leaders, and which was to become a convener, right? So we engage and connect with policymakers, most notably the members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus themselves and their staff, who are in many ways just as critical as the members in terms of making policy or recommendations, I should say, in crafting policy. But also that we had strong ties and relationships in the private sector with corporate executives, and of course, being a nonprofit ourselves in the nonprofit community in terms of advocates, activists, researchers, et cetera. And so we started finding ways, most notably with our annual conference, but then increasingly with these one-day summits, to convene a variety of leaders to take a deep dive around a particular issue, right? And so the Tech Summit is the one you're mentioning. It's actually going to be our third that we're having 3 years in a row now. It's set for December 8th, and it actually might even be extended to December 8th and 9th. There's so much interest. And as we're adding sessions, we're realizing we've got to do it sort of a manageable amount of Zoom time per day for folks. But certainly we think technology was one of the reasons we started doing it, was because we realized it was absolutely critical, right? We sort of knew even 3 years ago that it was something that was increasingly a part of everyone's life, was increasingly the ways in which people accessed information, the ways in which people manage some of their lives, and that technology in some ways could provide solutions, as technology often does, and simplify and ease and even increase the benefits that people have in life. But at other times, in some ways, it helps to hold gaps and disparities in place. It serves to maintain barriers and to keep inequities, right? And of course, this year in particular, it's even more crucial than ever because we've seen that it's infinitely more essential to our lives as a result of the pandemic, right? And now it's not just about information. It's not just about media consumption, which is another piece, that technology is often raised about, but it's also now things as fundamental as education, right? For as far down as kindergarten, right? And it's also health, right? The ways in which people are accessing the explosion of telehealth is a perfect example of the ways in which technology is now even more a part of our lives. And so what we decided was it's important for folks in cases like this to be not just familiar with the trends and the challenges, to sort of have a glimpse of what the future looks like, but also to understand what the barriers are that are being created, sometimes even inadvertently, but by aspects of society like technology that hold it in place. And to have them, again, the different stakeholders talk to each other, right? The policymakers talk to the practitioners, to the tech executives who are doing things, to talk to the researchers and the nonprofit leaders in the fields, to hear from each other, to wrestle with these questions together, to try to find solutions and ways forward, which is the other piece about the summit, right? Which is thinking about finding ways, and maybe, in fact, I argue, the industry, technology is one of the places where there actually could be, and so we want to foster conversations to see if there are best practices already emerging, right? If there are reforms and ideas, if there are new activities that are being that are happening in the technology industry that policymakers could learn from to actually think about crafting policy that ensures that bias isn't inadvertently there, for example, or that security and privacy is maintained, or most fundamentally, right, that access is available, right? So that people can both get onto technology, find affordable ways, or that someone's economic status doesn't actually preclude them from being a part of the digital economy simply by virtue of their economic status.
Yeah, and so I think that you raise a very interesting kind of theme in your remarks, and this is this idea of kind of unintended consequences, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Technology really kind of makes us confront our blind spots in a very kind of real and immediate way because the impact is so immediate and it's scaled so quickly. And I think that really kind of leads into, I think, a fundamental question about digital inclusion, right? So when we talk about digital inclusion, the term itself clearly conveys the idea that there are people and places that have been historically excluded from the benefits of digital opportunity. You know, from your perspective, do you mind sharing how you think we got here? Who do you think is most impacted? And, you know, how are you working with industry leaders and policymakers to establish more inclusive connectivity policies to expand access to digital tools?
Yeah, so I think one of the ways I think we got here is that, I mean, it's important to sort of look back and assess essentially sort of how technology kind of emerged in our society, right, and how it grew and developed. And I would argue that, for one, from what I've seen, I think it seemed to me pretty clear anyway that for starters, digital opportunity was not universally distributed, right? It was actually something where it was cutting edge new trends, which basically meant, and the way the resources it required meant that it was sort of more well-off, for example, school districts that were able to incorporate technology into learning and to actually teach young people about it, right? And I'm talking way back, the 80s or so, which basically created the generation of folks who were now technology, or at least the first round, I should say. Now, there's been several since, but the first generation of technology leaders, you listen to the stories of the Bill Gateses of the world and so on, and they talk about the fact that, like, there was a computer in my high school, and I went to the computer lab after class, and I was so excited and learned about coding and so on and so forth, right? And people talk about these things. Well, certainly Bill Gates went to a private high school, if memory serves, and if not, it was one of the schools in one of the better parts of Seattle, right? And it was, so for starters, there was sort of a stratification. For me, I think in many ways, it boils down to an economic stratification, which has this overlay, as we've learned in society, the intersectionality of things like economics and race play out, where then you had underrepresentation in terms of the people who were able to access the earliest forms of technology or to innovate and develop the initial ideas around technology ended up being predominantly white and predominantly middle class or wealthy themselves, right? And so that started it. And as you mentioned, in terms of what sometimes are referred to as blind spots, people started coming up with solutions, thinking about solutions and ideas and innovations for technology based on what they saw around them, right? Based on the needs, even the challenges, the problems they were trying to fix were sometimes problems that were specific to them. They weren't necessarily thinking about solving problems that low-income communities were having. And so, again, it was self-perpetuating. And so as a result, the digital economy has grown. And I would argue, the industry, the field of technology has developed as well, in that you needed significant resources to get fully engaged in it even after you learned about it, right? So a person needed to be able to access a lot of capital, either from the often mentioned friends and family round, right? Well, if you come from a low-income community where there's not a lot of college graduation, there's not a lot of dollars in the friends and family round, or to be able to access venture capitals and to present in a certain way, which we've now, again, folks have revealed, there were, again, unconscious even biases regarding who looked like an entrepreneur. There were judgments around, for example, what kind of schooling a person had and which schools they went to before deciding whether to invest in those startup companies. So that even if a person who came from a different background, a different walk of life, a different university, had a really great and brilliant idea, it was often harder for them, and still is sadly to this day, harder for them to access even the capital to allow them to create the things. So now people are finally starting to turn to questions that the uses of technology, for example, like democratizing access to finance, right? Thinking about new solutions and ways that low-income communities can build credit and access finance and leverage financial tools, which again wasn't originally the thinking, right? The original thinking, the earliest waves of some of this digital technology was like how to help be better and more effective in the stock market, right? How to do investing and so on and so forth. There's all of those apps and those tools that have been built. And now it's sort of like saying, let's help folks who don't have bank accounts figure out how to sort of use technology, right? So it's come in waves, but in my mind, that's part of the piece. And I think what we need at the end of the day is like I said, to find solutions. And so in my mind, again, the industry can be leaders here so that then we can create policies that are in fact universal and widely accepted, that build in these best practices and ensure that, again, these biases, these barriers, these disparities, even when completely unintended, are not created or perpetuated.
100%. I think that what's clear today, right, is that achieving the goal of full digital inclusion and universal broadband adoption, is going to take a collaborative and integrated approach with policymakers, with private industry, with diverse stakeholders such as CHCI, and in partnership with local communities. And I think from if I could kind of ask you from your perspective, what are some specific steps that Congress or regulators or members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus are taking or should take to ensure that we really are delivering real solutions for diverse communities across the country in order to achieve our shared goal of an inclusive tech future?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that can be done and in fact are being done. So for one, I think ensuring that we leverage the resources of the government to make the core investments that we need as a society, for example, in infrastructure, in education, and in workforce development. In my mind, those are sort of three good, clear examples. So investments in infrastructure, right? Broadband access, right? The development of, and not just low cost, increased sort of access and management of systems to, for example, to the internet in the obvious places, but also rural, right? That's one of those things where, again, there's this weird mental model that people have in their heads. When they think about rural broadband access, they think of Appalachia, right? They think of low-income white folks in communities, and they don't realize that there are significant segments of people of color, Latinos in particular, but African Americans as well, depending on your part of the country, who are also in rural locations, who are also cut off from digital infrastructure, right, and technology. And so in my mind, figuring out ways to do that, much the way we laid out the federal highway system, much the way before that we electrified the nation, in my mind, again, COVID has revealed to us is that folks, internet access is increasingly becoming sort of something that is universally needed, and we need to find ways to make sure all of the country can get to it in both a quick, reasonable, quick and viable way, right? So slower internet access, again, as we've learned both with health and education, and not to mention work, is not sufficient and not good enough if you have sort of a second tier. It needs to be quick and affordable, and it needs to be affordable, right? It also needs to be something that it's not a question of only if you can afford the good internet can you therefore access faster speeds and therefore take advantage of all those resources. That's one. Two, education, again, much more clear cut and straightforward, right? Is investments in education and ensuring that again, both technology is incorporated and that schools and school districts, again, low-income school districts are often the ones that have the greatest trouble, are able to provide internet access, are able to ensure that every student has access, for example, to a device that allows them to access the internet, and also that people are learning how to use technology, right? That teaching techniques, again, as people have been forced to learn the hard way immediately overnight, right? It's not as simple to simply just do, for example, video teaching. It's not as simple to simply say, use the app and learn at your self-guided pace, right? There's a lot of development and increase that can be done with that, and we need resources to do it. And that's at the federal, state, and local level. And then, of course, lastly, workforce development, right? We need people who are reflective of the diversity that is America throughout the workforce in the technology space as well. We need folks who are coders and programmers who therefore, again, are thinking about solving the problems that different populations face. And we also need people at the leadership levels. We need people driving serious decisions, making the deals, growing the companies, driving the entire company's direction, again, who are more diverse than they have been historically, so that we actually achieve that kind of vision. And I think government and policymakers can help incentivize those things, can ensure that de facto discrimination, again, even when unintentional and even when not desired, make sure that it doesn't happen by building in safeguards and guardrails that allow for all of that to flourish in a way that is equitable.
I completely agree, and I echo everything that you've said. Marco, thank you so much today for a great conversation. And to everyone who's watching from home, please make sure to follow Marco Davis and CHCI on Twitter. I'll make sure to link their information in the video description below. Please also make sure to follow HCTP on our social channels at HCTP Policy to be the first to hear about our upcoming conversations presented as a part of this year's Digital Inclusion Summit. So until then, please remember to tune into the conversation, to speak out, and to stay connected, because the future needs our help. So see you next time.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.